Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. Berlin is hosting a significant gathering of European leaders today as the E5 group meets to discuss Ukraine, defense spending, sanctions, and Europe's role ahead of the NATO summit in Ankara. But beyond the military agenda lies a larger political question: whether Europe can agree on a common strategy for Ukraine and even on who should represent the continent in any future talks with Moscow. Joining us now in the studio is Iryna Krasnoshtan, Program Director at the International Center for Ukrainian Victory. Good to have you back with us. Welcome.
Thank you for the invitation.
So if we're looking at Berlin today, these 5 major countries, that includes Poland, Germany, France, the UK, Italy, all talking about what's important for Europe. Ukraine is essential. What is Kyiv trying to gain out of this the most? Is it more commitments to Patriots? Is it interceptors? What do you think is the biggest, let's say, wish out of all this?
Yes, I think air defense will be one of the key issues on the agenda, but I think E5 in general will be a follow-up from the recent G7 meeting. We have seen that, there was some progress, and Donald Trump even supporting the declaration on unwavering support for Ukraine. So I think that European leaders would want to build on that momentum, especially that actually Mark Rutte, Secretary General of NATO, is at the same time at the Washington DC meeting with the US President. So I think the attempt will be to get more financial support for Ukraine at this moment, because there is a general understanding that there is a momentum happening, as it was called at the NATO Defense Ministerial, that the window of opportunity is there for Ukraine. So I think Ukraine expects the European partners to step in right now, because I think that the window of opportunity doesn't last very long, as you know. So we need more air defense and, of course, more financement also for Ukraine drone domestic production, because we've seen these drones being very successful for the mid-range, for the long-range strikes on Russian territories. So I think Ukraine is interested to have more resources on that. And, of course, long-range capabilities, I think, would also be on the agenda. But this is the main, I think, priorities for Ukrainian side on the defense track. But let's not forget also that the preparations for the winter are already starting. So probably energy support for energy resilience of Ukraine would be also important, and also sanctions, because we need more pressure on Russia right now. As I mentioned, the momentum is there, so maximum pressure should be from different sides. And of course, as EU is discussing this next 21st sanctions package, I think that would be the right moment to kind of for the European leaders to more resolutely approach that.
Mm-hmm. You talked about this window of opportunity now, but also at the same time, if we look at the last few weeks, you mentioned G7, we also had then after that the European Council, so all the EU leaders, all 27 meeting in Brussels. And then part of what came out of that, though, is about outreach to the Kremlin, right? This came from Antonio Costa's office, President of the European Council, of saying, well, and then the Germans had a problem with that. The French weren't so happy. Some supported him. Now we have this E5. Again, who speaks for Europe? But ultimately, what is Ukraine's position in that? I mean, is there, let's say, an angle which is more favored? Because if we look at also the E3 format, we go into numbers. That was the UK hosted in London a few weeks ago. Starmer there, who's on his way out now. Germany, France, but also Zelenskyy present. So which is the preferred method, if you can maybe analyze that a bit for us?
I think that, of course, for Ukraine, the E3 format was a very useful format, but as we've seen, there was a lot of negative reaction from Italy and from Poland on that side. So I think it is useful that now E5 are meeting, and they will try to kind of find a common approach about who will represent Europe. But the problem is that, of course, I think that there should be one person representing, Europe, because it's not useful when there were too many people, because then, all this who is agreeing on what, and, needing to clear everything with different parties, it's becoming a little bit more complicated. And that's also maybe why US was a little bit more successful in that way for some time, because it's one person that you have to speak to and not several people. But also, I mean, what ultimately Zelenskyy mentioned, that, I mean, Ukraine wants to have like a final say about, like, Europeans can discuss among themselves, and we know know there were different names suggested, but then it would be actually for Ukraine at the end to kind of say the final say in that. But I think that beyond names, what is very important is to think that what is generally the strategy towards Russia. What do we want to achieve at this point of time? As I mentioned, I think pressure is what we want to achieve at this point of time. But then how we move from that pressure to potential negotiations, because basically the point of all this pressure is to put Russia in a position where Russia would need to make certain sacrifices. But also what I wanted to mention on G7, and I forgot what is also very important for Ukraine, was that US also with European leaders agreed on potential licenses for Patriots production in Ukraine and in Europe. And I think that would be also a major point for the E5 discussions, because I mean everyone understands that the stockpiles of Patriot interceptors have been depleted also because of Iran war. So I think it's also in Ukraine's and in European interest to start to move faster on that.
Mm-hmm. But also about this pressure, I mean, you mentioned a few of the sanctions package. I mean, that also has to, again, go to all the EU member states, 27 member states. What kind of other pressure at this point is Ukraine looking for? Let's say the E5 could potentially provide that, let's say, the EU couldn't do. What specifically are you looking for that the E5 can do? I mean, these are still these 5 major economies in Europe.
Yes, I mean, we always are interested in basically increasing pressure on energy resources of Russia, and then shadow fleet is always on the agenda, and I think tougher sanctions. We have seen that there have been tougher steps from some of the countries, but I think it's still far from the how to say, the most optimal scenario. But on the other hand, I think Ukraine has been also doing a lot on what we call our own sanctions, with all the strikes on oil refineries and so on. So I think that Ukraine takes a lot of agency in that as well, not only waiting for the European side to do something, but also implementing our own sanctions, if we can say so.
Mm-hmm. And also the word sanctions, we've talked about this before, is what Ukraine likes to call kinetic sanctions, right? Which is these long-range strikes, drone strikes on infrastructure, oil refineries in Russia. We've seen that uptick quite a lot, actually, in the last few weeks. Putin seems to be rather riled because he is talking about it, right? He's mentioned it. It bothers him. It's starting to bite. Fuel rationing in Crimea. Where do you see this go? I mean, is this the kind of pressure, do you think, that Russia will bring Russia ultimately to some kind of negotiating format realistically, truly?
I think so, and I think that this strategy is working, and we see also a lot of action in Crimea, and I think Crimea can be, I wouldn't call it breaking point, but something close to a breaking point for Russia, because I mean it's a very important thing for them, but it's also for Ukraine. Since 2014, the occupation, I mean Crimea for a long time was something that a lot of people were saying just forget about it, but Ukraine right now shows that, you know, with all these strikes on the logistical infrastructure and so on, situation in Crimea is not resolved, so we are moving to kind of isolation of the logistical route of Crimea. There are things that can change the situation, because also people who are there, the Russians who have thought that they will have a nice peaceful time in nice beaches of Crimea, they are seeing that they have to escape from there now. So I don't know if this will mount to the pressure point, of course, for Russia, but combined with everything else, I think Crimea is very crucial at this point.
But also, I mean, moving from that front line to something else, I mean, President Zelenskyy, this is approaching a week now. Thursday, tomorrow, will be a week since President Zelensky's ultimatum to Belarus, to President Lukashenko, saying very much that these relay stations, those Russian relay stations close to the border with Belarus and Ukraine that operate very much about drone strikes, he says he wants them removed. And I think the quote goes something like, if you don't remove them, we will. That ends tomorrow, this ultimatum. Do you think he'll go through with that and remove them if they aren't removed by the Belarusians?
I think, of course, the ideal scenario would be that Belarus would remove it under the pressure, because seeing how things are developing in Crimea, as I mentioned, and with the strikes on the Russian territory, I think they should consider this quite seriously. But I think that at this point of time, since the ultimatum was made, it is very likely that if Belarusian side will not do anything about it, the Ukrainian side may actually implement what they said.
But at the same time, doesn't that also, I mean, that marks a point where Ukraine would be attacking another sovereign nation, no?
Yes, but let's not forget the fact that Belarus has been, it's not just a random country that does nothing in this war. I mean, let's remember that in 2022 it was the Russian troops that were invading Ukraine from Belarus. So Belarus is accomplice into Putin's plan from the very beginning. So Ukraine actually from the very beginning had a right to kind of attack Belarus in response to that. So I think at this point, you know, we were just waiting for a really long time. And again, I think that Ukraine still hopes that Belarus will do it on their own, that we will not need to do anything. But I'm sure maybe not. I think some steps will be going that way, maybe not the strikes exactly, but I think that there will be some sort of response if Belarus is not doing anything about it.
Right, and we'll see if on Thursday, tomorrow, what the situation will be. It'll be an interesting one to watch. Look, thanks for all of that. Always appreciate Iryna Krasnoshtan there. Thanks for coming by. And thank you for joining us here on World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for News and Commentary. Goodbye.